Boss Man. Yeah, that's how a lot of people remember me. Hey, it's funny because every once in a while, people come up to me at conventions and they say, "Did you know they used to do a comic strip of you, Boss Man comic strips?" And I look I try to have as blank a look as possible on my face and say, "No, what are you talking about?" And then they show it to me, and I go, "What? I can't believe they did this!" And I'm thinking, "Hey guys, didn't you think I looked at the comic books?"
Live from the Talking Joe studios, it's Talking Joe.
Talking Joe is on the air.
Hey, it's me, Mark, and welcome to Talking Joe, the G.I.Joe comics podcast. Now, today we are lucky enough to have a very special guest. It is Marvel editor / legend Tom DeFalco, who played an important role in the creation of the G.I. Joe comic book all the way back in 1981/1982. So we will be talking to him very shortly, but I will not be doing that alone. Joining me, as always, is a real American Tim. It's Tim Finn.
Hi, Mark. Hello, listeners and viewers. Let's bring in our guest.
Here we go. Welcome, Tom.
Hey guys, thanks for inviting me.
Thanks for being here. Tom, I'm near Boston. Mark is on the south coast of England. Where, roughly, are you?
I'm in the New York area.
Eastern time zone. Cool.
The Eastern time zone, yes. I spent way too much time on the West Coast, but whenever I had a place to live, it was in New York, in the state of New York somewhere.
And you're joining us today from your home office?
Yeah.
I see some Archie Digests over your left shoulder. I see a stack of Archie Digests, right? Is that what I...
Yes, you do.
Okay. I see a Batman hardcover on the top shelf and a Marvel hardcover. Can you tell us about some of the neat books in your space?
There's a bunch of Edgar Rice Burroughs books, a bunch of Robert E. Howard books, a bunch of Will Eisner books, Walt Kelly books, and just a lot of stuff.
Is there a sort of a trophy shelf of collections of your work? Is there a Spider-Girl omnibus or some Fantastic Four soft covers?
Yeah, but I don't keep them in my office. They're. I keep them in another room as they come in. I just throw them in a closet. I don't pay as much attention to that stuff.
Right.
I used to warn Ron friends, don't look at the published work. All it can do is depress you. And I still don't look at the published work unless every once in a while they call me to do a story connected to some previous story or something, and then I have to go and do the reference to remind myself how the characters speak and their situation at the time.
Is the most exciting thing what you're working on now and working on next? Is it always kind of thinking ahead rather than trying to look back too much?
Yeah, Stan used to tell me that he loved the story he was working on at that moment. Me, most of the time I hate the story I'm working on because it's never as good as I want it to be. And I'm always figuring, I'm going to finish this story and then and maybe the next one will turn out better.
Very good. So the blurb for your intro here is that you were born in June 1950. And you're best known for your association with Marvel Comics, with long runs on Amazing Spider-Man, including on the Clone Saga, infamous story there, Thor, Fantastic Four, the creation of Spider-Girl and Spider-Ham, and as the 10th editor-in-chief from April 1987, with 7 years or so in the role through to 1994. One of the longest runs in that post. But for us, the most important element on your CV is as G.I. Joe editor, credited as editor for issues 1 through 6. So before we get too deep into G.I. Joe, as a preamble to get to that point, can you maybe just talk about a little bit about your background and how your, I guess, childhood interest in comics kind of led you into the world of Marvel?
Well, I became fascinated with comic strips as a child, and I would follow things like, Mandrake the Magician and the Phantom and Pogo and Leonard Stars on stage, and would often cut out comic strips from the newspaper. Hopefully after my father had read the newspaper. If I cut it out before he read the newspaper, he was not too happy. And somewhere along the line, one of my cousins, my cousin John, I believe, handed me a book with Batman in it. It was a comic book. I'd never seen one before. And I remember that Batman scared the heck out of me, but I was fascinated by this concept of comic books, and then discovered that my local candy store had them. And from then on, I was kind of hooked on them. Around 10 or 11, I was starting to outgrow the hobby. And then I stumbled upon Fantastic Four number 3 and 4 together and bought them both. And there was something magical about those comic books that I still think is magical today. And they hooked me and made me a hardcore Marvel fan. And I've been with comics ever since.
Yeah, it's the ground floor of the modern Marvel universe as we know it, really, isn't it? The start of Fantastic Four.
Was that candy store? Where was that? Where were you growing up and finding comics?
It was a little town called Elmont, and there was
in New York.
In New York,
okay.
And there was just a local candy store that we called it a candy store. It was basically a soda shop. Had racks. It had a spinner rack of comic books, a spinner rack of trade paperbacks. Not trade paperbacks, mass market paperbacks. That's where I saw my first Tarzan books with Frank Frazetta covers. Card shop, that sort of thing. Just the general, newsstand. And I would go there once a week to, check out the comic books. At a very early age, I knew I wanted to write stories. I didn't really think that I would be writing comic book stories because when I was growing up, there were only two good comic book writers, Stan Lee and Robert Kanigher. And I figured, I'm not connected to either one of those guys, so there's no way I'm doing comics. So, I did the standard, work for the school newspapers, that sort of stuff. When I went to college, I, started to work for a local giveaway newspaper, and that led to the local actual, a newspaper. And I worked for the college PR office, and I actually wrote and sold a couple of short stories and started working on a weekly comic strip and all sorts of stuff like that. And when I graduated college, I was out looking for a job. I remember going to a magazine that I had sold some short stories to. They said, well, you're a writer. Go home and write. But I, thought, that you needed a job, a regular 9-to-5 job. And I sent out a resume to different companies, and one of them was Archie. And Archie called me up and offered me a job. And I worked in their production editorial department, and then, did some coloring, and then, finally convinced the editor that my stories were not that terrible, and he bought a few and then started buying more and more. And then from there, I branched out. I started to work for Charlton Comics and DC Comics and eventually Marvel Comics.
Tom, when you were working for Archie, did you live in the city? Did you go to Archie's office? Where was it? Were you working from home?
Well, when I started out, I would commute into the city. I lived on Long Island. I'd commute into the city every day and work in the office. The office was on 61st Street and First Avenue. And, as I started to do more and more freelance, I cut back the days I was going into the office. I think at the end I was going into the office maybe 2 days a week to edit the Archie Digest books, which when we started them, I'd seen Disney, Gold Key had done some digest books, and I remember taking them to the publisher and saying, "Hey, I think we should do these." And he initially said, "That's a stupid idea. Get out of here, kid." And then about 2 weeks later, he came in and says, "I've got this brilliant idea," and he showed showed the digest book, and then Victor Gorlick, who was the production manager, editor, turned to me and said, "Okay, wise guy, you dumped a lot of work on us with these things, so this is going to be your problem." So for years, I was editing, all the digest books.
All right. So for people who haven't read Archie or haven't read Archie in a long time, why would a digest be, for the production person, a lot of work? Or why would a bunch of digests be a bunch of work?
Well, I think when we started them out, they had like 192 pages in them. So, we had to go back through the old files, get the black and white artwork, get copies of the comic books, assemble it all together, make copies of different things, correct any spelling errors. It ended up to be a lot more work than it sounds.
The digests are reprints or mostly reprints, right? Sometimes they have a new lead story. Is that right? So just this is just a big, and there's so many of them that this is just a big sort of pipeline of work.
Yes. In the early days, they were all reprints. If these days, they now, a lot of them have one or two new stories in them. So.
Yeah, and bringing it back to G.I. Joe somewhat as well, we did get the sort of the G.I. Joe kind of digest reprints eventually in the mid 80s, and I guess without the popularity of that format being pioneered by you back then, that probably wouldn't have happened either.
Yeah, that at the time, I wanted to do those digests. I wanted us to have the same page count as the Archie comics and the same paper and the same printing. And, eventually when they came out, they had like half the number of pages and the printing was terrible. And I was just not very happy with those G.I. Joe digests, any of Marvel digests.
You had to have pretty keen eyesight to be able to read the fine print.
I was, like I said, I advocated them, I pushed them and that sort of stuff. And when they finally came out, I looked and said, "What is this nonsense? Come on, guys."
Do you have a sense, since we're on the G.I. Joe digests, which, just to be perfectly accurate, the title is G.I. Joe Comics Magazine, but they are digests and everyone sort of calls them G.I. Joe Digest. Do you remember those sales being good or surprising? Was this an opportunity to get G.I. Joe comics or reprints into places that hadn't had G.I. Joe comics? This was about, outreach, right?
Yes. Everything we did was about outreach and stuff. It's too many years. I don't remember the sales on those things. But, G.I. Joe had a strange sales history. When G.I. Joe first came out, we couldn't give him away. In those days, we had two major forms of distribution. We had the mass market distribution, which went to newsstands, and we had the direct sales, which went to comic book stores. And for the first year, we couldn't give G.I. Joe away in the comic book sales, the comic book stores. I think that Heathcliff might have outsold G.I. Joe. It was very frustrating to us because G.I. Joe was everything that, comic book stores, were asking us to do. There were commercials on TV for the comic books. And it, became one of our top selling newsstand books because Civilians would see the commercials and go to their local newsstand, pick up G.I. Joes by the handfuls. Like I said, one of our most popular newsstand comics. And, in the course of, for the first year, like I said, we couldn't give it away. And then in the course of like 3 months, G.I. Joe jumped from one of our lowest selling direct sales books to one of our highest selling direct sales books. It took the comic book store owners almost a year to realize this was selling out every month, and that they needed to order more copies. Comic book store owners are a cowardly and superstitious lot.
or were. Perhaps you mean were in 1982.
I'm not so sure.
Oh dear, Tim. And yeah, the image on screen is the comparison of the direct sales edition for issue 2 versus the newsstand edition with graphics from Greg Augustin at the After Action Report website. And this this is the visual distinction between the two of them, that one of them had like a Spidey head and one of them had the barcode. But issue 2 particularly seemed to be one of the very earliest hot books in the kind of the comic collecting market, the one that was known for being harder to find, and in terms of back issues being a little bit more expensive as a result. And I guess that's talking to your point that maybe that it wasn't ordered quite as well as maybe the market wanted.
I guess so. I don't know about values of comic books. To me,
Yeah.
I always look at comic books and they have one of two values. You read the story and it touches something deep inside you, and then it's priceless. You read the story and it just lies there, then it's valueless.
I will say, to Mark's observation, when I was getting into G.I. Joe comics a couple years after issue 2, and I saw full page ads in Marvel Comics for mail order companies with back issues, I was struck that issue 1 was maybe $20 or $25, and issue 2 was double that. And I didn't understand. And so I think what Mark is circling is that there were more copies of issue 1 because surrounding the launch with the toy and the first animated TV commercial that specifically hyped issue 1, Marvel set a higher print run, we think. And Jim Shooter had talked about a sales incentive for issue 1, that issue 1 was actually going to be returnable for the direct market, just issue 1. And then issue 2, I think the store owners are sort of catching up with it. Like, what is this? No. It's this. And then, as you're saying, a year later, they're actually catching up with demand.
Yeah, in the direct market, in general, sales only go down. First issue comes out and the store owner orders 100 copies. The second issue, he's cut it down to 50 copies. Third issue, 25 copies. And this is before the comic book has come out. As a result of this, sometimes comic books are canceled before the first issue has even seen the light of day, because the sales have just fallen down.
Mm-hmm.
Luckily with G.I. Joe, our newsstand sales were so strong. Actually in those days, Marvel's newsstand sales were so strong that we could hold on to books. And, and the direct market, whatever we made on the direct market was considered gravy. But we were, making most of our money on the newsstands. Things like, Frank Miller's Daredevil. If it was based only on direct sales, that book would have got canceled early on.
And what about the subscription part of the Marvel model? Because we sort of understand that in certain years, G.I. Joe was probably the highest subscription comic directly from Marvel and sort of being posted out to the customers.
I very rarely looked at subscription numbers, to be honest. So,
was it a relatively small component of the overall sales?
Yeah, I've spent my time looking at newsstand sales and direct sales,
Mhm.
watching, if, was a title gaining, was a title losing, and I didn't pay as much of attention, as maybe I should have, to subscription and foreign sales. Foreign sales factored in, a number of times with a number of decisions, because we found out that, Heathcliff Barbie, titles like that were selling so much in terms of foreign sales
Mhm.
that we would do a second title because, the foreign sales made the comic book profitable alone.
Mhm.
The Todd McFarlane Spider-Man title. I decided to add another Spider-Man title because all the foreign licenses wanted more Spider-Man material, and I realized that we'd make a profit of it. I didn't even have to publish it in the United States.
Wow.
And and then later on, when Todd got on it, and then it sold like 3 million copies of the direct sales, I looked like a genius, even though it was a very basic financial decision that had nothing to do with Todd McFarlane.
Can I ask a general question? I want to go back to you sort of arriving at Marvel, having worked for Archie, DC, Charlton. I think there's this sort of mystique or mythology of, the bullpen and comics in New York in previous eras, because, we're fans, and so much of culture now, toys and movies and TV and games, is driven by stories that were made previously. But this is still a machine. It's a publishing machine. But when you were getting into comics professionally, and when you got to Marvel, can you talk about your sense of this as a job that you went to, and it's a job that you wanted? Was this any kind of sort of embarrassing job because, there are rungs on the ladder of publishing, or because, comics were considered just for kids? How did you feel when you got to Marvel, and how did you talk about your job to people who weren't in comics?
Okay, this is going to sound goofy, but when people would ask me what I did, I would explain that I wrote for comic books, and then the first question they would ask is how do you get all the words in those little balloons? And I realized they all thought I was a letterer. As time went on, when people asked me what I did, I said I sold life insurance, and that ended the conversation.
No follow-up questions.
There was a time when I would I did things more than comics, and there was a time when I was talking to a studio about doing some work for them and that sort of thing, and my agent said to me, "Whatever you do, don't tell them you worked in comics. It's better that you're unemployed than that you worked in comics." But these days, now people hear you're in comics. Oh, you must also be involved in the movies. Some people yes, some people no, and some people are involved in movies that have nothing to do with the comics they worked on. It's a whole different world now.
Mm-hmm. But I guess to see the mainstream success of some of this stuff that you had your hands on directly in terms of creating or writing must be somewhat surreal in terms of the likes of, which we mentioned, Spider-Ham, seeing him on the big screen, for example.
Yes, that was a surprise.
Or a Fantastic Four feature film released to theaters just 2 days before we sat down to do this interview.
Yeah. And that's a pretty good film, by the way. I don't know if you've seen it yet.
Yes. I took my employees to see it Thursday, opening night.
Fantastic. All right. It's a lot of fun, that film.
Yeah. Mark, we've done some preamble and introduction stuff. Mm-hmm. Do you have any more, or do you want to jump to the sort of G.I. Joe question in 1981?
I've got a general question, which was just doing my research. I looked at Tom. I looked at your LinkedIn profile, and there's a great quote in here, which is, "As an editor, I am both a compassionate leader and a stern taskmaster who's worked with some of the most demanding licensees and temperamental creative people in the history of publishing." I wondered if I could leave a pause for you to maybe reflect on that or expand on that. I'm interested in the creatives, particularly there.
Well, here's the thing in any creative field. I always say there's one secret to writing. You have to care deeply about what you're writing. If you're doing a one-page joke for Archie, you have to really believe that that joke is funny. If you're doing a 10-page story, for Marvel Team Up, you've got to really believe that this is something that the readers, need to read, that says something about the characters. And if you're really passionate about what you're doing, you're going to bump heads with the people around you. There is a natural conflict between editors and creative people. An editor has to look at each story and think long term. Is this good for this character in the long term? Where, a writer looks at a story and is just thinking short term. This particular story, I have this great idea for a story. And the editor looks and goes, yeah, but that story ruins the character. It may be a fun story, but it's no good for the character. An example, when I was editor-in-chief, at least once a month, someone would come to me and propose, I got a great idea for a Spider-Man story. We're going to kill Aunt May. It'll be a very emotional story. It'll be a great story. And I said, okay. And then what happens the following month? But they didn't care about the following month. They only cared about, that one story. And like I said, at least once a month, somebody would come to me with that story. Usually someone who had never written a Spider-Man story before. There were, also Fantastic Four stories that, would pop up on a regular basis from people. So, you're dealing with people who are passionately involved and, sometimes you're, butting heads with them. But since, I came from both sides of the fence, I could feel for the guys and I could talk to them. I could talk to them in their language. A number of times guys would come in and give me these lame excuses as to why they didn't finish their work in time. One artist, I sat him down and said, you gave me that same excuse last week. And I said, you can't keep repeating the same excuses. And I gave him 5 better excuses that he could give to an editor. He was not pleased with that. But, it helped, that in many ways, I always thought of myself as a writer who was temporarily masquerading as a staff person. I mean, even when I came on to be an editor at Marvel, it was supposed to be a temporary job, only supposed to last maybe 6 months or so while Jim Shooter organized the editorial staff.
All right, so I'm looking at this John Byrne issue of Fantastic Four from 1983, and in the bullpen bulletins page, there's a shuffle. Right, Al Milgrom has just gone freelance. He's gone back to freelance, but he's going to keep editing Marvel Fanfare. Carl Potts is moving around. Danny Fingeroth is getting promoted to edit the Spider-Man books because Tom DeFalco, we made up a new fancy title for Tom, executive editor, and put him in charge of, stuff? What stuff? There's so much to do. So Shooter mentions The Life of Pope John Paul II and the Raiders of the Lost Ark movie adaptation, and hints at the Star Line, the all ages Star Line. So is this that moment you just referred to, sort of helping, or is this later?
This is much later.
Okay.
When I was first hired to be an editor at Marvel, Jim Shooter had asked me, said, you were editing at Archie. You want to come on and, work at Marvel? And I said, at the time, I said, Jim, I haven't had a full-time job in years. I only go to Archie like 2 days a week. I'm not sure I can, I have the stamina and stuff like that to come into an office 5 days a week. And he said to me, well, listen, can you help me out for maybe 6 months? I said, 6 months I could do. And then, I started working there on staff at Marvel. They, at the time, a lot of the books were late. And Virginia Ramita came out with this thing called the Virginia Schedule, which everybody reacted to. Oh my God, how are we supposed to ever get our books on this schedule? And I remember looking at it thinking, yeah, I have no idea how to get the books on that schedule. And I turned to my friend, to my assistant editor, Mark Rumwald, and I said, Mark, here's what we're going to do. We're going to call up all of our guys. I'm going to tell all the writers. We're going to tell everybody. We're going to now work on a 3-week schedule. Every 3 weeks, I want a plot from every writer. Every 3 weeks, I want a penciler to be done with an issue. And if they fail to make that those 3 weeks, we're going to commission fill-ins. And nobody wanted fill-ins in those days. And I said, because, science says that if you do a book every 3 weeks, at a certain point, you got to catch up on the schedule. And that's what we did. And we eventually got our books on time and more than on time. On time to the point where every month the ad flats would come in. And then the next day we would turn in all our books for the month.
Wait, what was that term? Ad flat? What's that?
They basically told us which pages of the comic books were editorial pages, which were where the ads were going.
Okay.
So, we got to the point where we were turning in, all the books, and then I said, okay, now I could start. I don't have to come into the office every day anymore. I can, stay home and do my freelance.
But then you become Spider-Man editor a little while later.
No, that's when I was Spider-Man editor.
Okay.
I started out as Spider-Man editor.
Okay.
And I remember when Shooter told me I was going to get the Spider-Man books, I said, Jim, I'm the new guy. You should give it to somebody experienced. And I said, what do I know about Spider-Man? He says, Spider-Man's just like Archie, except with superpowers.
To put a fine point on it, going back a minute, you said if you were going to institute fill-in issues if the schedule wasn't followed, and you said nobody wanted fill-in issues. You mean the regular writers and artists?
They did not want fill-in issues.
Why did they not want fill-in issues?
Because it would, break their string.
Okay.
They wanted to, tell their stories, and they didn't want anybody interfering in between.
I sometimes, my example of this sometimes is Iron Man, Demon in a Bottle, which is this, famous story written by Denny O'Neil. And I have the 1988 Marvel paperback collection of it. And this is when Marvel was still figuring out paperbacks, because I think the ISBN is on the spine. And the third issue, the first page, Tony is flying coast to coast, and it's drawn by someone else, and maybe it's written by someone else. And Tony thinks, I'm going to take this opportunity to remind myself how I became Iron Man. And the next 20 pages are a retelling of his origin. And then the final page, he touches down in California, and he says, okay, now back to the mission. And then chapter 4, the next month's issue of Iron Man, continues the actual story. And I sort of explain to people, sometimes when you're reading a collection of old issues, this kind of thing happens.
Yeah. And that's why, nobody wanted fill-ins. But in those days, since most of our sales were newsstand oriented, if you missed shipping, even by a week, you might as well just burn the whole print run.
Why?
Because the book wouldn't get distributed properly. It wouldn't get out there on the newsstands, or only get 2 weeks on the newsstands instead of 4 weeks.
Because the next issue is going to be on time and hit that newsstand.
Yeah.
Okay. Were there financial penalties if you missed shipping, either from the newsstand or from the advertisers who had paid for ads?
I don't know about the advertisers, but I know that if you were late getting a book in to the color engravers, you had to pay penalties. And if the printer got the book late, you had to pay penalties. So yes, there were financial penalties attached to that.
You have rented press time with the printer. Yeah. There's a certain number of minutes or hours that they're going to print your book, and then they've scheduled that the press is going to print someone else's book, the next comic book. And if you're late, you mess up their schedule.
Absolutely. That's how it was in those days.
Right. Mark.
Right. Yeah. Shall we get to the beginning of the G.I. Joe portion of this interview? So
yes,
what, Tom, is your recollection of the first time that you heard about G.I. Joe at Marvel?
I guess Jim Shooter said to me, a couple of us are going up to Hasbro. They're thinking of relaunching the G.I. Joe toy, and they want to do a comic book. And I don't know why I was chosen. It might have been because my books were all on time. And I remember that it was Shooter, myself, Larry Hama, Archie Goodwin, Nell Yomtov, Mike Hobson, the publisher. And I think that was the group. There might have been somebody else, but I don't think so. And we went up there and we met Bob Prupis and Kurt Bazigan, and they were showing us their prototypes for G.I. Joe, and they explained to us, G.I. Joe, he's a sniper, he's a frogman, he's a this, he's a that, and we're kind of looking at him, and I think that I don't remember who said it. Says, I don't know if that's going to work for a comic book. And said, how about if G.I. Joe is the name of a team? And these are all different people. And they said, well, okay, but who's Joe? I said, there is no Joe. It's the name of the team. And they kept saying, but who's Joe? Yeah, we're going to write this out for you. And then we went back and had our discussion about what this comic book should be. Everybody decided we needed a faceless villain, like the stormtroopers in the Star Wars thing. I believe Archie Goodwin came up with the name, Cobra Command. And Larry did, I'm going to say 99%, percent of the work. And maybe I'm short selling Larry on that. But he was the guy who, did all the biographies and broke everything down, character by character, that sort of thing. And we went back and we, presented the stuff to Hasbro, and they looked at it and they were kind of thrilled with it. As well they should be. And we found out that the reason why they had come to us is their advertising agency, Griffin McCall, had realized that if you're advertising a toy, there were in those days there were all sorts of restrictions on how you could advertise a toy, but there were absolutely no restrictions on how you could advertise a comic book. And they figured, let's do a comic book. We'll advertise the comic book, and get kids excited about the comic book. And then later on bring out the toy. And it was a brilliant idea at the time, and we thought it was great because hey, they're advertising our comic book. And you remember the first commercial with the tank coming over the hill? Well, while we were working on the comic book, we got a call to go over to Griffin McCall because they wanted to, discuss the first commercial for the comic book. And, Larry and I thought, we got to go prepared. So we actually worked out a storyboard for a commercial. That was the tank coming over the hill and all the explosions and stuff. And we walked in and we met, I think, with Joe Bacall. And we said to him, yeah. And we showed him the storyboards. He says, well, this is exciting, but you can't have animation like this. You can't show tanks. You can't show explosions, because he was thinking about a commercial for toys. And we said, well, we were told you could do anything because it's a comic book. There are no restrictions. He said, I don't know. And so Larry and I left him thinking, we gave it our best shot. We'll see what they do for the commercial. And then a couple of months later, they show us the commercial. It was our storyboard. And around that time, I was talking to Kurt. And Kurt, if you guys have spoken to him, really good guy, really smart guy, really sharp guy. He and I are talking. We've been working together for a couple of months. And he said to us, yes, Hasbro has done this market survey, and they've discovered something very important about the toys and the toy industry that no other toy company knows, and that we're going to use this knowledge to make Hasbro the number one toy company. I said, really? You know something that nobody else knows? He goes, yeah. And I said, wow. And he says, do you want to know what it is? And I said, no. I said, I really don't want to know what it is, because, I got a big mouth. I might let it slip, and, this is proprietary knowledge. I really shouldn't be party to it. And Kurt says, no, I could tell you. And I said, I really don't think you should. And Kurt says, no, I'm going to share it with you. And up until that time, everybody believed that marketing was the sole thing that sold toys. Hasbro had done this survey and had discovered that the actual toy has an effect on the sales. All right. Yes, I had the same reaction. And I said, you're telling me that, the quality of the material is what actually sells it. He goes, yeah. I said, yeah, we knew that. We knew that. I said, that's why you came to Marvel instead of DC. I will tell you a story about G.I.Joe #1. So, Larry Hama does the plot, and great story, great plot. And Herb Trimpe, a total professional, realizes, I got to move guys from this part of the island to that part of the island. And to make life easy for himself, he built a scale model of Cobra Island.
Wow.
Built the island so that he could figure out, how to move the characters around. And then they gave us a set of the prototypes, which I gave to Herb. And then when Herb came in to drop off the first issue, he said to me, how deeply involved is Marvel with this toy company? And I said, well, I think we're pretty deeply involved with, we're committed to do the comic. They're going to advertise it on TV. And he says, I said, why, Herb? He says, well, because these toys they're kind of cheap. They've kind of fell apart. I said, Herb, those were prototypes. Those are, just made out of clay and stuff like that. Those aren't the actual toys. Wow. He goes, oh, and he felt guilty about that. So when he dropped off the issue, he brought the island in, and we gave that to Hasbro with the broken prototypes. I don't know whatever happened to that island.
Okay, so there's a big buildup in March of '82 because Hasbro reveals the toys at Toy Fair, and I think is giving away issue 1 at Toy Fair, and then it's on sale, newsstands and comic book stores, I think the next week or 2 weeks later, and it's been advertised on TV. And in the Bullpen's Bulletins page, not this one I'm holding up, but a different one, issue #1 of G.I. Joe gets sort of hyped 2 different months of bullpen bulletins. Like, this is coming. And then, did you check out issue number 1? And also issue number 1 is double sized. And it's got a backup story, and it's got a higher cover price than normal. So,
and printed on special paper and all sorts of stuff.
Printed on
Baxter paper.
Baxter paper. Yeah. So can you reflect on, or do you have recollections of issue 1 hitting with this other stuff in the air?
What do you mean hitting?
Becoming available for purchase when it debuts.
Yeah, not really.
Okay.
I was probably more concerned at that time about working on issue 3.
Right. Okay. Or all the other books.
Or all the other books, yeah.
Mm-hmm. If I can rewind back a bit to the to that initial meeting and going, I think it was that you flew to Pawtucket, as
yes.
Jim Shooter describes it. Do you have a recollection of the concept of Cobra being created in that meeting? I think it might have been Archie Goodwin who said, "But who are they going to fight? We need some baddies." Yeah,
I know. We had decided on a faceless enemy, like the stormtroopers in Star Wars, and Archie was the one who came up with the name Cobra Command.
And do you think Star Wars was a big influence? That it was very much in the zeitgeist at the time.
Absolutely, because Hasbro was coming out with the action figures, which had been popularized by Star Wars.
Yeah, part of the sort of contrast here is that the 1960s G.I. Joe, there are no bad guys. And every figure, whether it's a Marine or an astronaut or a mountain climber or a deep sea diver, they're all G.I. Joe. And there's no story, there are no names, there are no code names. And so G.I. Joe shows up in development in 1981. And what are the other things that are popular, like Star Wars and everything that Marvel was publishing?
Jim Shooter described your invitation to that meeting as being he thought probably because you were kind of his unofficial assistant, as he described it. But at what point do you recall moving from just being along for the ride for the meeting into it being an official assignment, as being I guess the main Marvel person spearheading the editorial push to make this thing happen?
I think I was always aware that I was going to be editing the comic book, at least initially.
Okay, and do you recall the point at which Larry's role became official as well? Because Larry has this story of him being the last person to be asked to write it, which is not necessarily consistent with Jim Shooter's own recollection. Do you have a particular memory of at what point Larry was brought in to become the writer?
I think I think Larry was brought in before I was brought in. I am not aware of G.I. Joe being offered to anybody other than Larry. I love Larry, but every once in a while he thinks he wasn't as held in as high regard as everybody actually held him.
That's a nice segue. So, Tom, was Larry held in high regard at Marvel? Can you speak to, how so? Why?
Because he was a very talented artist and he was a terrific writer. I've heard stories where that Larry had trouble getting assignments and stuff like that. And I think before G.I. Joe, nobody knew he wanted to write because he never told anybody he wanted to write. So the only things that people would offer him were artist assignments. After G.I. Joe, Larry wrote titles like The Avengers and Wolverine and I think some other X stuff. So he was obviously held in high regard as a writer, and he's a terrific writer.
And part of why he's a terrific writer is that he had been an artist, and so he knows what the artists want or don't want.
And editing other writers' work at that point as well.
Yeah.
And the Larry's involvement in the project was a little bit of an evolution of a previous project that he had been developing called Fury Force. So here's an image that Dan Klingsmith had shared on Facebook of some prelim art for that project. So this is dated 1981. Is that a project that you had any recollection of Larry sort of developing prior to working on G.I. Joe?
Yes. Larry had shown me that, and I thought it was terrific. And I remember going to Shooter saying we should do this, and offering to edit it because I thought it would be a terrific project. Now then, G.I. Joe came. I don't remember how many months later, and we ended up doing G.I. Joe instead of the Fury Force.
Mm.
For people looking at the image where it says Sergeant Fury, this is Nick Fury's son. This is not Nick Fury. And just to solidify what Tom just said, this art is dated Larry Hama 1981, and Hasbro and Marvel make the deal to do issue number 1 in 1981. So if there's ever this feeling that Larry Hama was so far along developing Fury Force, and then it was cut short because of G.I. Joe. I think it's a much smaller window, and I think Larry had lots of ideas, and editors and artists had lots of ideas, and this is one of many that didn't go forward, and then Larry could use a lot of this development in issue 1 of G.I. Joe and in the characters.
Yeah.
Another interesting image that Dan shared on Facebook was some correspondence between you, Tom, and Kirk Bazigian at Hasbro, sort of charting some of the evolution of the progress for creating issue 1. And this particular letter that I've shared on screen talks about sharing 3 cover sketches that were prepared for the G.I. Joe comic, which I think includes these 2 images here on screen, these color markers. Do you have a recollection of these particular images?
I'm afraid I don't, but that one is obviously the one we used.
As a follow-up, and maybe the answer is I don't remember, how good are you at identifying artists? Do you have a guess who drew this and the previous one? Because Larry has said they are not him.
It might have been Ed Hannigan.
Okay. Who was a Marvel artist and a Marvel cover sketch artist.
Yes, I used him for a lot of cover sketches.
Okay.
Yeah, that's my conclusion as well, because I know that he did do the prelim cover for issue number 5, which is this one currently on screen. For the issue name, Tanks for the Memories, and it seems to be in quite a similar style. And if you used him for issue 5, that would make sense that potentially he might have also been used on issue 1 for the prelim. That's the one that ended up looking like this.
All right.
And then it felt like the process of running up to creating issue number 1 was a sort of a very collaborative back and forth. That it felt like the train was moving before the track had quite been laid down. That in this back and forth of letters between you and Kirk, it looks like they're sharing designs with you, Herb's drawing some prelim sort of sketches interpreting those characters, and you're sort of sharing them back. For example, like this one of Scarlet here, who's pictured a little bit differently to how she appeared in the comics eventually. Do you have any sort of recollection of the back and forth between you and Kirk, sort of working on the evolution of the design of the characters, the look of the characters before they actually?
Yeah, I don't remember. The only thing I remember of the back and forth is that Kurt was he was a pleasure to work with, and we worked on G.I. Joe and a bunch of other things together over the years, and he was always a total pro, and like I say, a pleasure to work with. And I think when we first started, working, yes, we were, the train was moving before the tracks were down on the ground, because comic book, deadlines they were tight.
And did you get the sense that the big push was to try and create this issue 1 to kind of have a big launch and make sure that was sort of concluded as almost a project in itself, and worry about what happens after that point a little bit secondary?
Well, when you're a comic book editor, you're always working on the next 2 or 3 issues at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And we had a lot of pressure to get the first one out, because it had to be printed in time for Toy Fair. Had to coordinate, the TV commercials had to be coordinated with the release of the comic book. We were juggling up a bunch of dates, and getting any comic book out to, I used to think getting any comic book out to the printer was a miracle in itself. Because we had to deal with the creative teams, we had to deal with the printers, we had to deal with the coloring, engravers. We knew this was going to be an exceptionally big print run, and we were just racing and hoping for, racing and hoping for the best.
It's one of the things, sort of looking at some of the behind the scenes designs and things like that, is around the creation of the Cobra characters. It felt like the Hasbro thinking on the design of the G.I. Joe characters initially was a lot more advanced. As to your meeting in Pawtucket, the Cobras hadn't even been thought about, but at that point, so it's almost like you've started almost on the comics, but the baddies haven't quite been fully fleshed out by the point that you're beginning to write and even draw the book. And one of our observations was that Cobra Commander here, for example, looks very different to how his toy counterparts looked for these first few issues, and it's only later on in the series that Cobra Commander began to look more like his toy design.
Yeah, Cobra was something that Hasbro hadn't planned on, and I don't even think it was part of their initial toy release. But they liked the concept so much that they ended up coming up with a toy, later on.
And Dan was also kind enough to share a particular image of the pencils side by side with the inks that he had a copy with, and sort of made the observation that the character of Dr. Burkhart, between the original pencils from Herb Trimpe and the finished inks from Bob McLeod, look very different. It looks like potentially that character might have been black or Latino in the original version, with slightly different features and black hair compared to the elder blonde woman that she eventually became. Do you remember any of the sort of the back and forth about some elements like that in terms of Hasbro reviewing and giving feedback?
I'm afraid I don't at this stage of the game.
That's okay. I appreciate it was a long time ago. But one that you might remember a little bit better was a particular edit to a line of dialogue for the audio only listeners of this particular part. I'll call out. I'm sharing on screen the panel of Hawk from G.I. Joe issue number 1, where he says, "We're soldiers. Our job is to follow orders, to do the impossible, and to make it look easy," which eventually was updated in just last year with a Real American Hero issue 1 Harmer director's cut, where it is amended to, "Our job is to do the unthinkable and be forgotten." And I think you know what I'm going to ask you about, so maybe I'll just pause there and let you tell the story.
So, that's something that's haunted Larry for years. I remember when I read the line, I thought it was too inside baseball, and I also thought, for the readership we're going for, we needed to, simplify it a little bit. Now, I had come from Archie Comics, where the rule was you don't bother the writers. If you needed editing changes or anything else like that, you did it in the office. You never bothered the writers because they're home creating. And that's how I was trained to edit. So I saw a line that needed to be changed, and I changed it. Then later on, Larry was not very happy about it and complained to me, and I apologized to him at the time and said, listen, Larry, just didn't occur to me, that, it didn't occur to me that it would mean that much to you or anything else. And I thought, this would work better for our readership. And I thought that was the end of it. And, 30 years later, 40 years later, it still comes back to haunt me. But in comic books, I had an editor when I was working at DC who, changed all sorts of dialogue just so that he could add footnotes. And, that's why I said you don't look at the published work, because all it can do is depress you.
I'll also jump in and say that perhaps separate from or greater than Tom, your specific editing philosophy of changing dialogue, Marvel editors and editors in chief made changes to comics all the time in the 1980s. And, famously there are covers or sort of entire half issues that were reworked at the last minute to make them better or for worse. And so, if in interviews now and then over many years, this specific rewrite has been called out and its sort of imports or legend has grown, there are many, many examples of Marvel comics, one word, one whole word balloon, the meaning of an issue, half the art for an issue that got changed between writing or drawing and publication.
That was the business in those days. The world has changed.
I had another question just about creating of characters for issue 1, because the character of the Baroness featured in issue number 1 and didn't have a toy until much later. I just wondered, Tom, if you had any particular memories of this character being created and any dialogue with Marvel about originating this particular character in the pages of the book.
I don't, but Larry was, Larry is a very creative guy. It was, created all these characters, gave them all their personalities. I can't, emphasize enough how much of this G.I. Joe was more Larry Hama even than Hasbro. Hasbro had just, created figures, and Larry created the personalities that went with those figures. I'm sure, Hasbro would debate this with me, but I look at Larry as the co-creator of G.I. Joe, because, without Larry, there wouldn't be these personalities. There wouldn't be a Storm Shadow or Snake Eyes or anything else like that. And, none of these characters would have the personalities that they had. This was all Larry Hama.
I think also about other licensed comics that Marvel published based on toys that didn't run as long. And certainly there were some great toys and some great TV ads, but there was this one writer who wrote this comic for a long time, longer than others.
And he's still writing it.
Right. Mark, do you have a slide? Do you have a question about what became issues 6 and 7?
I was just going to, while we're just still on number 1, I was just going to ask if about the script process, because it was, for the first time I think ever, possibly, I'm not too sure, Mark Bellomo shared an image of the original script to issue 1 and describes it as being written as a short story, which was then subsequently adapted into more of a Marvel style script. So it sounded like the kind of the scripting, and possibly with Hasbro being the audience of that script initially, was a bit of an unconventional process.
Yeah, well, Larry tended to work as we all did in those days, plot script. So you would kind of write a plot which basically told the artist what to draw. And I think Larry made this one, more short story-ish, just because he knew that civilians would be, reading this. And then, I don't know if he then broke that down into a plot for Herb, or just gave Herb the story. I don't remember at this stage of the game.
Mm-hmm.
I know that as time went on, Larry would be, just doing basically Marvel plots.
That's probably a good segue into sort of the subsequent issues. There was a little bit of flux in the creative team for the first few issues. It was Herb Trimpe, Don Perlin, and also Trimpe being credited with plots for issue number 3 and issue number 6. Do you have any sort of recollection about why Trimpe ended up with that plots credit and sort of just the dynamics of the change in the creatives?
Well, I know that the first issue was a big strain on Herb, and he wasn't sure, how much of this he wanted to do. And I kept saying to him, Herb, I think this is going to be a big seller. I think you want to stay on this book. And then later on, once he got the royalties for the first issue, he realized I was right. Again, too many years have gone by. I don't remember why, Herb plotted the third issue or whatever.
Yeah, I think possibly the issue number 6 makes a lot more sense, because that introduced G.I. Joe to the October Guard, which was a kind of evolution of a concept that you had co-created with Trimpe, called the Pravda Patrol, which saw print, I think, maybe the same year or the year before, in the pages of Bizarre Adventures. So I guess, are you able to talk to what the Pravda Patrol was and where that came from?
I'm afraid I can't. I don't, I remember that that was an issue of Bizarre Adventures.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And Denny O'Neil, I forget how many pages that thing was, but at one point Denny said, hey, I could use is that a 6-page story, a 7-page story?
I think 5. Yeah.
A 5-page story. Hey, I could use a 5-page story, very quickly. Can you come up with something? And I think Herb was in the office, and I said, what do you think, Herb? and then we hashed it out, and it was kind of a last minute thing to help out a buddy.
And to add a fact here, even though Marvel published it, it was creator owned. So you, Tom DeFalco, and Herb Trimpe owned this story. And then originally, Mark, I think I'm bridging to what you were going to say next. It is Pravda Patrol that are in the next 2 issues of G.I. Joe. What we got as issues 6 and 7, but were scheduled to be published earlier, when someone said, someone at Marvel or someone at Hasbro said, no, we can't have these characters owned by other people in this Marvel comic with Hasbro characters.
Mm-hmm.
And so someone changed all the faces and some bits of costumes, and I think Larry Hama came up with new names, and so that's how the Pravda Patrol becomes the October Guard for what was published as issues 6 and 7. So now that I've just summarized all that, Tom, anything to add?
You know more about it than I do.
Okay.
Okay, very good. But yeah, very cool creations in the world of G.I. Joe. sort of knowingly or not, that you played a role in there, Tom. Enduring fan favourites, the October Guard, who sort of saw their genesis in the form of being the 5-page private patrol story.
5-page last minute thing that then and I'm trying to think, because I think Herb and I did this story very quickly just to help Denny out, and I think that's why he gave us the copyright on that thing. And I don't, I can't figure out why else we got a copyright on it.
Tom, you were only the editor of G.I. Joe for the first 6 issues, which takes us from March '82 for publication date, April, May, June, July, August, to the summer, early fall, and then Denny O'Neil becomes the editor of the monthly G.I. Joe comic. Do you remember why you did not continue editing the monthly Marvel G.I. Joe comic?
I don't know the actual reasons, but back in those days, they would often pile things upon me. Once I got all my books on time, they would always add new things, and even I had to sleep occasionly. So
perhaps it was a case that the train was running on time now. It was less of a crisis to keep G.I. Joe going. It could be moved to somebody else and give you the next urgent thing to get working.
Although later in the year and the next year and the next year and the next year, there are more characters and toys to introduce. And so G.I. Joe was always a hard book to keep running on schedule.
Oh, always. I do remember one silly story. Unbeknownst to me, Larry and Bobby wanted to do something in one of the comics.
Bobby Chase.
Bobby Chase.
Okay.
Bobby Chase,
editor of G.I. Joe after you, after Denny O'Neil, after Bob Harris.
Right.
Okay.
And they wanted to do something, and the guy at whoever they were dealing with said, "I'm going to have to check with the Hasbro Creative Committee." And Bobby and Larry were kind of shocked because this is the first time they heard about this Hasbro Creative Committee, and they came into my office to ask me about it. By this time I was editor-in-chief, and they came in to ask me about it. And as they coming in, my secretary says, "There's a call for you from Hasbro," and Larry or Bobby says, "Yeah, we wanted to talk to you about Hasbro." I said, "Well, let me find out what they want." And I get this call, and somebody says, "Blah blah 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 blah. We want to know whether or not the characters can do this." I said, "Well, let me check right now because I have the people in my office who can answer it." So I turned to Larry and Bobby and I said, "Hey, Hasbro's on the phone. They want to know whether or not the characters can do this." And the two of them look at each other like, "What the hell?" And Larry says, "Yeah, absolutely." And I said to the guy on him, "Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no problem. Well, you're welcome." And I turned to them and I said, "What's the problem?" And they said, "Well, we asked Hasbro if we could do this." And they said they had to check with the Hasbro Creative Committee. And I said, "What the hell is the Hasbro Creative Committee?" And then we realized, wait a minute, I think we're the Hasbro Creative Committee. So now I don't even know if Larry remembers that incident, but that cracked me up. And I know of one other time when they were doing the G.I. Joe and Transformers, and we're doing the comics, and there was a big question, who's directing the show? Who gets to decide what characters can do and what characters can't do? Blah 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 blah.
You mean Marvel or Hasbro?
within, it was a question of Marvel, Sunbow, and Hasbro.
Okay.
Marvel, Sunbow, and Marvel Animation.
Okay.
So, I ended up going there for a meeting with the creative people from Sunbow, their writing staff, and I think Larry was there. I don't know this for sure, but walk in and I could see everybody's ready for a tense meeting. All right, and I looked at the guys and said, "Here's the deal. We won't mess with you. You don't mess with us." And their lead writer stares up. Sounds good to me. and that was the end of the meeting.
So I don't know if this is a follow-up to that specific story. Griffin Bacall was in New York.
Mm-hmm.
Sunbow had an office in New York.
Right.
Sunbow was sending all of was coordinating with scripts in Los Angeles, where Marvel Productions was. Right. And a little later, Sunbow opened an office in Los Angeles. I think in '85. Do you remember going to a meeting with Marvel Productions or with Sunbow in Los Angeles?
Yeah, that's where
Okay. All right. So that story you just told, that's not you going cross town.
No. That was in Los Angeles.
Okay. And then presumably that's in the summer when it's also convention season? Or do you think this was a special trip?
Oh, I don't recall that at this stage.
Okay. But you made a trip or a couple trips to have this kind of conversation?
I only made the one trip to have that conversation.
Okay.
In those days, I was going to Los Angeles on a fairly regular basis because we were trying to sell television shows, we were trying to sell movies, we were trying to sell anything we could sell.
You were representing Marvel Comics back in New York, and you were part of the team that might pitch or go to a meeting. Is what you're saying,
right?
Okay.
Yeah. The world was very different in those days. Marvel basically couldn't give their licenses away, as opposed to today where, you can't walk into any store without seeing a Marvel license. And anytime the company needed money, they came down to me. And would often say, listen, unless we make $200,000, an extra $200,000 by the end of the year, there isn't going to be another year next year. The first time that happened, I think I was editor-in-chief for maybe a month and a half or a month, and they dropped that on me. And they said, we got to come up with some ideas by tomorrow. And that's when I came up with the idea for the Marvel Masterworks, figuring, hey, we'll sell these hardcover books.
Because those were $30, and that was a really high price point compared to $1.50 comics or a handful of $9.95 paperbacks.
Yeah, I don't even think our comics were $1.50 at that stage.
Okay, maybe in '89 they were just $1.
Yeah, but that's when we came up with that, and the Marvel Masterworks. I always thought, yes, I came up with the idea, but it was a cheat. Every Marvel fan dreamed of the day that the first 10 issues would be in a hardcover book. I mean, come on. I mean, I remember the next morning I walked in, I pitched the idea to Grunwald, and he says, well, yeah, I've often dreamed of that. I said, yeah, everybody dreams of that.
And just to put this in the timeline, Marvel Masterworks predate DC Archives by 2 years, I think.
DC often followed us. I used to say that our job was to be trailblazers and, go ahead and blaze the trail, and DC would follow us by a year or two and make it look better.
I have to say, I really like the publication design on the Masterworks from '89, and I really like the publication design on the DC Archives from, I think it's 1990. So I think in that case, different, but I think you both did a great job. I'm just talking about Dust Jackets. If you have thoughts about reproduction or, the introductions or, page count, but I'm a sucker for a sewn binding in a hardcover.
Yeah, I thought the DC books when they came out really looked classy. I think ours, we barely got them out in time to be printed in time for Christmas. So,
but as an example of the difference in the comic market, 1982 versus where we are today, and there are, I guess, untold differences. But one of the big differences in the way that people consume comics is that difference of the monthly book versus the trade. And back, a G.I. Joe is an example. I don't think we got a trade paperback collection collecting, a big run of the issues outside of things like the digests and so on until 2000-ish. A big difference to the way that the comics are consumed, of that sort of monthly, more ephemeral, get it when it's out versus collect it in a nice collection and have it on your bookshelf to enjoy forever kind of approach to the book.
Well, when I became editor-in-chief, I think Marvel had come out with maybe 2 or 3 trade paperbacks before that.
Mm.
And, one of the things, Grunwald and I did is we worked out a 3-year publishing plan, which was something Marvel had never done before. Because I thought, hey, let's act as if we're real publishers. And I, told them at the time, when you turn in a novel, you turn it in June of 1984, and it doesn't see the light of day till June of 1985, and maybe not even in June. They come out in the December thing. So we've got to start planning ahead. Up until that, Marvel was more haphazard. So we worked out a publishing plan, and one of the things was by our second year, I wanted to have a trade paperback, one every month, which everybody thought was really kind of crazy. That how many trade paperbacks could you really do? 12 trade paperbacks in a year that people would support. These days there's 12 paperbacks every month
or every week. So were those first 2 were Power of Iron Man, which is or Demon in a Bottle, and then Dark Phoenix Saga. But then the early ones were like Armor Wars, the first 3 volumes of the Nom, which reprinted the first 12 issues, the Claremont and Miller Wolverine miniseries. Do you know what that paper is called? The paper that the late 1980s Marvel softcover paperbacks are printed on. That's actually my favorite paper in comics.
No, I'm sorry, I don't recall at this stage.
Okay. So I just mentioned the Nom, and I wanted to just point out that my first comics came from a spinner rack at a Walden Books in a shopping mall. And next to the spinner rack was this sort of larger spinner rack that had trade paperbacks. It had that Claremont Miller Wolverine collection. It had 2 of those 3 Nom paperbacks. It also had the First, that publisher First, the color Ninja Turtles reprints. And
okay.
And my brother and I were really struck by the Nom, which for kids who were already into G.I. Joe was G.I. Joe adjacent, right? And of course, Larry Hama had been the editor of that first year and a little bit more. Was your trade paperback program successful after you came up with that publishing plan? Initially,
we were having a lot of trouble getting bookstores to actually stock the trade paperbacks. And, and our plan was that this should be an outreach mainly for bookstores. And it just took a while, for the bookstores to start, buying the books and stocking the books and then restocking the books once they were sold out. And eventually it worked because, nowadays you can walk into any bookstore and there's the whole graphic novel section.
Yeah. DC had hits with Watchmen and Dark Knight Returns because DC's sister company, Warner Books, could put some of those stories into regular bookstores. And then DC started publishing The Sandman as a series of graphic novels. And so DC built up its backlist starting in like 1990, 1991. And Marvel's sort of modern graphic novel backlist program didn't kick in until 2000, when like Joe Quesada and Bill Jemas were in charge. And there was a different, I think, sort of reproduction office pipeline and like deals with stores and warehouses. But certainly the sort of predecessor to that, the paperback program in the 80s and early 90s, sort of primed the pump.
Speaking about reprints, this one is an unusual reprint. It's the Treasury edition of G.I. Joe #1 that reprinted it in an oversized format. So to compare size, kind of that's your more regular size versus your Treasury edition, which unusually it's credited to Parks Run as the sort of publishing house that delivered it. Do you have any recollection of the Treasury edition of G.I. Joe #1 coming out?
No, not at this stage, but anytime we could get a distribution outlet for anything, we jumped on it because we wanted outreach. We wanted to get more and more people hooked on the habit of reading comic books, because we love the medium. And we thought that the more people exposed to this medium, the more people would love it, and it would be good for everybody.
Speaking of outreach, G.I. Joe was interesting in terms of Marvel's in-house licensing team also being responsible for the more general G.I. Joe licensing, sort of headed up by Nel Yomtov. And within that umbrella, I think he also got Herb Trimpe to produce some new original art and that kind of thing. Do you remember there being much back and forth between you and like the likes of Nell on some of that activity?
Again, not really. Okay. I mean, Nell has always been a good buddy, and we spoke on a regular basis, but I don't recall anything. I just saw Nell the other night.
Oh, and that licensing deal, Marvel being in charge of Hasbro's G.I. Joe licensing, was only for, I think, 2 years, and then Hasbro took it in-house. Tom, here's a general question. So you're editor of G.I. Joe for the first 6 issues, and then you are Marvel's editor-in-chief for the entire rest of the run of G.I. Joe. And a few minutes ago, you had an anecdote or two about the G.I. Joe comic after you were editor-in-chief. Can you talk in general about the challenges of maintaining a licensed book after, say, the first 6 issues, right? Because for the first 6 issues, it's yours. And then this comic, amazingly, it's published for the next 12 years. And it has different challenges and needs than maybe Amazing Spider-Man and Uncanny X-Men do. So, those TV ads were still going for a bunch of those years. But can you talk in a general sense about either G.I. Joe as a longer-term proposition or Marvel and licensed books sort of into the late 80s and into the 90s?
Yeah, there were a lot of extra challenges, especially with G.I. Joe, because they were going to be introducing new toys constantly. And everything had to be coordinated. And I know time and time again, Larry was working on a storyline and then had to abruptly change things in the middle because they decided that a character that was going to be featured in that storyline was no longer going to be introduced that month. He was going to be introduced, 6 months later or 6 months earlier. And they were always, they had to be very nimble on their feet constantly because, Hasbro suddenly decided, hey, we're going to do an ad for this thing and we're going to push this toy. And, they had to look and go, wait a minute, that toy is not in the comic book that's coming out that month. So now we have to, rejigger it so that it now is in there and it makes sense for it to be in there. And, that we were running into constantly with both, G.I. Joe, especially G.I. Joe and Transformers.
And to Tim's point as well, you sort of, you've got this overarching responsibility for the book throughout its entire history in terms of your responsibility as the editor-in-chief. Do you have any particular recollections of that sort of trajectory for G.I. Joe as it sort of soared in popularity, but then towards the back end, lower end, the sort of the sales numbers dropping off, and eventually it's seeing cancellation in 1994?
I don't know if the numbers justified it being canceled in 1994. All right, because around that period of time when they, the company suddenly had a wave of good sense and they decided to replace me as editor-in-chief. They also, made some other decisions that they were going to buy their own distributor. They also decided that they were going to only focus on properties that they owned, and that's when they gave up, the Barbie license, the Conan license, G.I. Joe and Transformers. They just decided that, the powers that be at the time decided, we're going to give up all these licenses.
Because those are things that Marvel has to pay for.
They have to pay for, but they were still making money on. And, they decided they were going to cancel the line in half because they... I always remember the meeting. There was a meeting where one time they said to me, we're producing 120 titles a month. And I said, yes, we are. And they said, if we cut down to, 60 titles, with the remaining 60 sell twice as well. And I laughed at them. Because it didn't occur to me that they were serious. And then I looked at their faces and thought, oh man, these guys are serious. And I said to them, no. I said, think of us. They said, well, a lot of retailers, a lot of readers are complaining that they can't buy all the Marvel comic books. And I said, that's good news, because that means that we're producing more comic books, than they can afford. I said, listen, guys. When the time comes to buy a new car, I go out and I look around. I find, 6 or 7 new cars that I would love to buy. I'm lucky if I can afford one of them. I said, but, think of this as movies. A weekend comes out and 3 good movies come out. And all right, so maybe Saturday you see one, maybe Sunday you see the other. And the third one you say, well, I'll catch that next weekend. And then a weekend comes by and no good movies come out. You don't then say, well, there are no good movies, so I'm going to go see a bad movie. You go out for pizza. So, if there are, Ghost Rider, there are 2 Ghost Rider titles out. You cancel one title. That the guy buying 2 titles doesn't say, okay, maybe I'll start reading Captain America now. It doesn't work like that. And he said, well, you got 4 Spider-Man titles. If you cut it down to 2, wouldn't they sell twice as well? No, because the same guy is buying all 4 of them.
Tom, is there a counter argument that if 2 Ghost Rider titles cut in half won't double the sales of one, should you add a 3rd Ghost Rider title, a 4th, a 5th? Should you add a 5th and 6th Spider-Man title? When is too much, right? If 120 books per month for you wasn't too much, and 60 may have been a target for your bosses, was there a number over 120 that you would have said, okay, now this is too much?
If I saw the sales being cannibalized or titles not working, then I would have said it's too much. What that number is, I don't know. But, one of the titles was a Marvel Tales. And they'd look at me and say, this title, why are we even doing it? And, because we'd make like $4,000 or $5,000 a month on that title. And I said, that's a reprint title. On a bad month, it takes a half hour to get out the door. I said, so we're making $5,000. Yeah, the margins are not great, but we're making $5,000 a month for half hour's work. Hey, that's pretty good, return on your investment. And $5,000 a month's got to be paying, keeping the light on somewhere. And I used to say, listen, if the publisher is making money, the distributor and the publisher, we were the ones that made the least amount of money per title. The retailers, were buying the comics at 50% off. They make the most amount of money. But if the publisher is making money, then everybody down the line is making money. So, I said to him, guys, canceling titles that are making money is idiocy. It's stupid. I said, even you guys aren't that stupid, which is probably not what you should say to the president of the company.
But was there kind of like a magic number that you would often look at the threshold, but at which point a particular title would fall below, and then they'd be in the danger zone? Or
oh yeah, we were looking at the titles, and we were studying where each one would be, and I knew the next 4 titles that were going to be canceled. I knew it 6 months ahead of time, and I had 4 replacement titles for them. So
I have read that Transformers was canceled when it dipped below 80,000. And in 1990, I think 1991, when Transformers was canceled, compared to Uncanny X-Men, 80,000 was quite low. Right now, 80,000 is quite high, and I think even from 1991 to 1994, when G.I. Joe was canceled, I think sort of the Marvel's cancellation threshold number had changed because other market forces had changed. Tom, do you remember a number, that threshold, like a specific number in a certain year or era? If a book goes below this, we're canceling it?
If a book sold under 100,000 copies on the newsstand, we would take it off the newsstand. And then if it sold under 40,000 copies direct, then we would look at it and consider canceling it. Wow. So if Transformers was selling 80,000 copies, there's no reason why it would have been canceled.
Okay.
And in the sort of final run of the last few issues of G.I. Joe, a good few of those issues were looked like they were inventory issues being run. So by writers and artists that weren't the standard team at the time. So yeah, I don't know exactly the dynamics of what was happening there, but one of them, which was issue 143, Dark Island, looked like it was an inventory story from. Probably, actually, it was you were credited as the editor, so I think it was probably from your run, something that had been stuck in a file for a long time and sort of surfaced just towards the very end of the run. It was written by Vic Sutherland with art by Tom Mandrake, and it was a story about Scarlet. I don't know if you have had any sort of particular memories of that inventory issue. Unlikely, but maybe if you can talk to the dynamics of creating and using inventory issues as part of a run like that.
Well, with any title, I used to tell the guys, have an inventory issue in case something goes wrong. Your pencil could catch the flu. Your inker, could get a toothache. And you should have an inventory that can be slotted in if at the last minute something terrible happens. Because again, if you your printing deadlines, you were screwed in those days.
And was it also used as an opportunity to do like a bit of a tryout for writers and artists, knowing that potentially it might not get used?
Yes and no. A lot of times with a new writer or something like that, you give them the assignment, but you rode them very hard to make sure that what they eventually turned in was publishable and was something that you'd be proud to have your name on. Mm-hmm. So a lot of times, a guy would come up with you'd say to him, "Yeah, do an inventory Spider-Man story," and then they would turn in their plot, and then you'd go over it and make them do it again until they got it right. And then when the story was drawn, you'd go over the dialogue 2 or 3 times, sometimes making them rewrite it, until it was right. That used to take a lot of extra time, but it was our way of, training our new talent so that they could do it correctly.
I think the last question that I had on my list of things to ask was just if you could touch on some of your involvement in the origin of Transformers at Marvel Comics, because there's a lot of crossover between Transformers readers and G.I.Joe readers. So how were you involved in the genesis there?
I'll tell you a goofy story about it. Hasbro came in and they wanted us to work on a new toy property, and they said, "But we need you to sign all these NDAs." And they showed up with one of their lawyers, because by then, everybody realized, oh, you got to protect these, your intellectual property. So, and they brought their lawyer in. So then our lawyer had to come in and go over the documents, and the meeting was supposed to start at 10 o'clock in the morning, but the lawyers, argued and rewrote and argued and rewrote. And about 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon, they finally came up to the document that everybody could sign. Okay. So we all signed the documents. And then, I don't remember who was presenting, Bob, Kurt, maybe somebody else. And they take out the Transformers and they put them on the desk. And Larry Hammer and I happened to be sitting across from each other. And we looked up at each other and said, "Excuse us a minute." And Shooter was going, "What's going on?" We'll be back in a minute. Wait a minute. They're doing the present. Pause it. We'll be right back. And everybody was kind of pissed off at us because, hey, we'd already been delayed 5 hours while the lawyers played around with the contract. So Larry and I go leave the room. He went to his office. I went to my office. We came back, and then we put Japanese Transformers in front of us because we had bought the toys, the Japanese versions of the toys. And the guys from Hasbro looked at, "Where did you get those things?" I said, "Forbidden Planet. They've been selling them for years." And then, I think Bob Hooper says, "Give me all the contracts." And our lawyer says, wait a minute. They can't sign it. These NDAs are no good. And Bob says, "Just give me all the contracts." Took all the contracts and he ripped them all in half. And he said, "All right. Yes, we bought a license for these characters." And then we wanted to develop them. And then around that time, there was another robot group. I think it was called Stariers. And I was assigned to work on the Stariers. So I had to step back from the Transformers. So you have the Chinese Wall. Me and my creative team, we're working on Stariers. Ralph Macchio, Bob Budiansky, those guys are working on Transformers. And then, I finished up on Stariers. And then they said, come on over. Help us with the Transformers. And I remember looking at the origin of the Transformers and thinking, wow, this is way too complicated. Something from the past and this and that. Can't we simplify this? And oh, no, we're already committed. Listen, the guys did a great job, but I thought it was just too complicated. And at one point they asked me to, retype something, the opening section of that, which I ended up doing. And then the next thing I knew about Transformers, we're in a meeting with Marvel Productions, and they're telling us, no, Hasbro created the Transformers. Hasbro designed it. And Shooter's saying, no, we did it. We did the development. And the guy from, Marvel Productions said, no, Hasbro did. I have this, this Bible here done by Hasbro. And Shooter says, let me see that. And he looks at it and goes, hey, Tom, is your typewriter still dropping that A? So,
wow.
Anyway, fun and games.
I'm a big when I'm not co-hosting a G.I. Joe podcast, I'm a big Transformers fan. And so wearing both of my hats, I enjoy that story. Thank you for telling that, Tom.
Yes, Bob Budiansky did a fabulous job on that. And he's the unsung hero of Transformers, like, Larry Hama is pretty sung. But
Budiansky has been invited to some Transformers conventions. I think he's somewhat sung, but maybe to the larger toy buying, movie going public at large, Bob Budiansky could be more sung.
Yes.
Yeah, and that sort of talking to the kind of the meeting that you were just describing, even if internally the kind of the credit of who did what to create kind of those Transformers mythos is less well understood, that possibly the public at large doesn't quite understand the level at which Marvel was involved in sort of setting out the story of Transformers with rather than the design of the toys.
Yes, and a quick reminder, in the same way that 60s G.I. Joe had no characters or names or story or bad guys, the Japanese toys that Hasbro was licensing from Diaclone and Microman had no names, no story, no characters, no factions. And so this was an invention of Marvel Comics and also Hasbro and Griffin Bacall and Sunbow Productions.
I've one last Hasbro related story. One time I'm sitting in my office and Bob Prupis and Stephen Hasselfeld was there. He's one of the owners of Hasbro, and we had worked together many times, and they were proposing that we do some other toy. I don't remember which one it was. And, Stephen noticed that I had business cards on my desk, and I had a card holder with business cards, about 200 cards in there. And Steve said, oh, you got a business card. Let me get one. And he takes one of the business cards and he looks at it and he says, when was the last time you looked at your business cards? And I said, yeah, I don't know if I ever looked at them. And then he hands me the business card, and somebody had crossed out, instead of Tom DeFalco, it said Tom DeFatso. And all 200 cards had been crossed out. And I of course recognized the handwriting right away. And I looked at it, I laughed at it, I said, come on, guys, you know the company you're dealing with. This is the kind of company we are.
Wow.
And the guilty culprit, I don't want to mention Ralph Macchio's name because why embarrass him?
Tom, I have run out of questions. I think Mark ran out of questions. Are there any current projects you would like to promote to our modest-sized audience?
Well, Ron Friends and I recently did a Thing Sandman story that appeared in something called Fantastic Four Fanfare #3, which, if you like the kind of nonsense that Ron and I do, You might want to check that out.
This is a 4-issue miniseries. Each issue has stories by 3 different creative teams. And so your story appears in issue 3.
In issue 3.
Okay.
We're also right now working on a Venom-like story, which will appear in Venom 252. They figured since the symbiote first appeared in Amazing Spider-Man 252, they'd get us to do a 10-page story in Venom 252. I remember when they got in touch with us and said, "You want to do a Venom story?" I thought, nah. Why would we want to do a Venom story? But Ron and I talked, and we came up with something which we think is actually kind of interesting. We tend to put a lot into 10 pages. Sometimes editors have often said to us, we put more in 10 pages than some guys put in 10 issues, but that's something else.
Tom, about 10 years ago, Ron Frenz drew about 2 issues of G.I. Joe that Larry Hama wrote, and they're great. He did a couple covers, and I thought, here's this guy who draws in this, what I think of in a positive way, this quintessentially 1980s Marvel style, which, refers back to other eras and other artists. And at the time, when Ron Frenz was drawing Thor, I didn't think this guy should draw G.I. Joe, but jump ahead to 2015, and I thought this guy should draw G.I. Joe, and then he did.
Yes. And around that time, it was IDW. They had gotten in touch with us and asked Ron and I to do a 4-issue limited series.
G.I. Joe.
G.I. Joe.
Huh.
And, we prepared the storyline, everything. It was, going to come out around the time of the G.I. Joe movie, but the G.I. Joe movie was not the hit that everybody thought it would be, so they ended up killing the project.
This was a separate continuity. Were you fitting your 4-issue story into something previously?
It would have been a separate story.
Okay.
Right.
And Ron Frenz did some artwork for it.
I believe so.
Like a cover or some character drawings.
Yeah.
Okay.
And we did the storyline for 4 issues and stuff like that. And it featured I think it was the Bruce Willis character.
Joe Colton.
Okay.
Yeah, that appeared in the movie.
Okay.
Huh.
But it ultimately, many projects come and go.
The 2 upcoming or current projects that you just hyped were Marvel Comics specific. Are there any other projects that you have done recently or are working on now that you'd like to tell our audience about?
No, not in the world of comics.
Okay. Any non-comics thing? Read in a book or keep a blog or?
No. I'm good.
Okay.
I'm a lucky guy. I get to live on many planes of reality, and like I say, I'm a very lucky guy.
Mm-hmm.
But nothing I want to publicize.
From your back catalogue, is there something that is the thing that you're most proud of? And if you were to say, if you read one thing of mine, I think this is the thing that is the best, or the thing that I can look back on with the most amount of fondness.
That's always so hard to say because, for you guys, a comic book is, maybe 20 minutes tops. And for us, we have to live with those characters day in and day out and stuff. So we have to really fall in love with what we're doing. And I've always tried to, create characters that I ultimately love, and hopefully the readers will love too. Because I want you to come back month after month to spend time with those characters. I sometimes look and think, maybe Spider-Girl, because Spider-Girl was only supposed to be one issue of What If. And then they asked, can you do 6 issues of Spider-Girl? Yeah. can you do 6 more issues of Spider-Girl? Yeah. And that went on for 13 years. So, it's hard. The readers decide what they like.
Tom, this has been a pleasure. Thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate being able to bring interviews with G.I. Joe alums to our listeners and viewers, and we like all the stories. So thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate it. It's nice to be remembered.
Yes, thank you so much. It's been really enjoyable and really, really good to get your insights. And as much as you played down how much you might remember, there was some real gems in there that you're able to share with us. So just for our listeners, as we sort of head out, I'll remind people that if you are new to Talking Joe and want to find us, you can visit talkingjoe.co.uk. That's the website that points to all of the places we can be found. And a big thanks to all of our Patreon backers who find us at patreon.com/talkingjoe, who are supporting the show. Tim, where can you be found when you're not talking to me about all things Joe?
YouTube at Atomic Abe, Hub Comics, my store, and my blog, arealamericanbook.com.
Fantastic. So I think that is us done, but remind us, Tim, of what we need to bear in mind until our listeners see us next time.
Tom, if you know those G.I. Joe TV commercials from the 80s, this jingle might sound a little familiar. Nobody beats Talking Joe, an international podcast!
Latest.